After the British government had started a naval arms race, they then tried to cut the Royal Navy's funding immediately afterwards. Then they were forced to, in fact, increase funding beyond even the original projections by public pressure, and so something finally seemed to click in the halls of political power, and the cash began to flow a little bit more regularly into the shipyard's coffers. As a result, the financial year 1910-1911 programme was tabled to include 5 capital ships, 4 battleships, and the battlecruiser Queen Mary. In the interests of speed, and also for a variety of other reasons, partially budgetary and partially the deceptive 12-inch 50 caliber Type A designation for the 13.5-inch gun being slightly more successful than they had originally planned for, the only navy that was looking like they were going to lay down their own super dreadnoughts anytime soon were the US Navy, and they were only building 2, and so it was decided to repeat the Orion class with only a few modifications. At first, the only changes were moving officers' accommodation further aft and providing 3-inch armour for the secondary guns in the forward superstructure. But other changes would soon follow. The foremast was relocated to forward of the foremost funnel, much to the gratitude of those in the spotting positions. In the Colossus and Orion classes, this mast had been placed behind the forefunnel, largely in an apparent attempt to economise on weight, as the legs of the tripod mast could then be used to support boat cranes. The size of the bridge and the overall forward superstructure was also increased, and secondary fire control stations were added to 2 of the turrets, one fore and one aft, just in case anything happened to the main fire control system, with the other 3 turrets fitted to control themselves only if communications were lost. They would also use a slightly heavier shell than previously, which held its velocity better at longer ranges and also had a slightly larger bursting charge. All of this and various other tweaks resulted in the new class, named King George V after the recently crowned monarch in keeping with the Royal Navy tradition of the time, being almost 20 foot longer and a fraction wider than their Orion class predecessors, displacing almost 23,000 tons, but thanks to the increase in length being proportionally greater than the increase in width, the same 27,000 shaft horsepower via 4 screws was still able to provide 21 knots, and all 4 ships proved capable of just over 22 knots when driven hard, with the fastest being clocked at just a fraction under 22.5 knots. The 4 vessels would be named King George V, Centurion, Ajax, and Audacious, with all being laid down in the opening months of 1911, although launch date varied wildly. The Royal Dockyards built ships clearing the slipways in around 10 months, while private yard-built vessels needed just over a year and about a year and a half, respectively. As a result, commissioning was somewhat spread out, with King George V entering service in November 1912 and Audacious only coming online in August 1913. Armament had remained the same as the Orions, though: 10 13.5-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, a pair superfiring forward, a similar pair aft, and a lone turret amidships. 16 single 4-inch guns were distributed in the fore and aft superstructure, and 3 submerged torpedo tubes, 1 per side and 1 aft, completed the weapons loadout. Belt armour was 12 inches thick at the maximum, with the single thickest piece of deck armour being 4 inches. The forward superstructure had a sharper cutaway than on the Orions to give the amidships, or Q turret, a wider field of fire, and the 4-inch guns were positioned mostly in the forward superstructure instead of being distributed evenly as per the previous design. Audacious had a very short career, lasting barely a year after commissioning, as in October 1914 she struck a mine which, unusually, detonated deep rather than on contact with the explosion near one of the engine rooms, resulting in an effect more similar to the more destructive magnetic mines of World War II. Thinking she'd been hit by a submarine, the ship signalled this to the rest of the fleet, which meant all the capital ships immediately left the area, which left only the smaller craft to help. Counterflooding helped to stabilise matters, and the ship initially made for the coast at about 9 knots to try and beach herself. But the increased water pressure of movement, combined with a weaker than it should have been longitudinal bulkhead, soon meant even more leaks, which meant more flooding spreading to the other machinery spaces, and the ship came to a halt. The cruiser Liverpool and the Titanic's sister ship Olympic, which happened to be passing by, took off all non-essential crew before towing was tried, but this failed after multiple attempts. Eventually the flooding became unmanageable, and she would roll over and sink about 12 hours after the mine hit. As she did so, something set off the forward magazines, destroying the ship and resulting in the only fatality, a sailor aboard the Liverpool who was hit by a falling piece of armour plate. The sinking was kept secret until the end of the war to try and deny information to the enemy. The surviving 3 ships were placed in the 1st Division of 2nd Battle Squadron at Jutland, along with HMS Erin, a formerly Turkish ship which was based heavily on the King George V design, which made 2nd Battle Squadron the most homogeneous battle squadron, since the other half was the entire Orion class. Although being at the head of the battle line, smoke from nearby light cruisers meant only a limited number of broadsides were fired, with no credited hits on major German vessels. After the war, the ships were mostly active, apart from a brief stint in the reserves for King George V, spending an awful lot of the early 1920s in the Mediterranean fleet. With the Washington Naval Treaty coming along, it allowed them to remain in service until the Nelson class were completed, and these were designed to replace them, at least tonnage-wise. Thus, King George V and Ajax were sold for scrap at the end of 1926, while Centurion was converted into a radio-controlled target ship, a role in which she served throughout the interwar period, before being rearmed with light anti-aircraft weapons and used in a variety of deceptive roles in World War II, including cosplaying as one of the newer King George V's, before being deliberately sunk as a breakwater in June 1944 as part of the D-Day invasion. She would be scrapped in place at the end of World War II, although with the nature of the shifting sands, there is possibly some portion of her lower hull or fittings still there.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.